First presenter is Elaine Anderson. Elaine is the Director of Compliance and Performance at Chartwell Retirement Residences. And no further introduction required.
So good morning, everyone. I'm going to just, in review for most people what you already know around the high-intensity needs funding changes that occurred in our industry in 2013. I'm going to assume for most of you that this is review, because you would be dealing with this in your daily work lives. And then just try to look at what might be some of the potential impacts that we've seen now that we've had this change and lived with it for about a year. So really what I'd like to look at is, like I said, the review of the high-intensity needs funding changes that were made in 2013. Just kind of do a quick overview of the review of the claims eligibility, and then that whole balancing of the high-intensity needs funding and the envelope spending that some of us have maybe experienced along the way in the last year. So just to give you an idea of what the changes were, the ministry refined their high-intensity needs funding program in January of last year to improve the focus of the program to be one of prevention. And when they talked about prevention, it was really particularly noted that they wanted to look at that in the area of wound care. So previously, the high intensity needs funding program had 13 different claims categories, and I will go through them for you just to remind you. They were wound care, vital pain management, treatment and transfer, staff training, ostomy supplies, oxygen supplies, assessments, oral feeds, enteral nutrition, total parental nutrition, supplemental staffing, preferred accommodation, and transportation for dialysis. So even just listing those, you can see how much paperwork, time, and energy would have gone into doing the submissions to high-intensity needs for claims. So in that aspect, clearly the changes they made have made it less paperwork for the most part for homes and for submissions. The ministry has now introduced a high-intensity needs per diem, and that's based on funding and goes directly into the home's nursing and personal care envelopes and your raw food envelopes. So this was done to assist the homes to continue to provide care and services in 10 of the previously mentioned claims categories, and I'm sort of taking some liberties with that and making assumptions that that was the expectation from the ministry's perspective. So we don't have those 10 categories specifically left that we need to do claims for, but there's still an expectation that those areas are met and funded in your homes. They just don't require submission approval, and they don't get that same reimbursement process. So that left us with 3 areas that didn't fall into those 10, and those 3 areas that were left that we still see are claims that are required are preferred accommodation, one-to-one staffing, and dialysis transportation. So along with that, the ministry also added 1 new claims area, and that being the exceptional wounds. So that again goes back to that piece that they really were focusing on prevention and wound care. So these areas continue to require claim submissions on either a quarterly or a monthly basis, depending on which of the areas you're doing a submission. And the new claims-based program is one in which the ministry is paying 95% of the eligible expenses, and the long-term care home shares the remaining 5% of those costs. The high-intensity needs funding can only be used to acquire supplies and/or services when funding is not available through other sources, and there's a need that cannot be adequately met without accessing the high-intensity needs funding. So in other words, you can't claim funding for these from the ministry if there's another source of funding that's available. So it could be DVA, it could be assistive devices program. So if there is another program available that would give you funding, you're not to claim through the high-intensity needs funding. The home also has to be looking and being diligent and making sure that they're using the most clinically appropriate product, and they're using it in the most cost-effective way. They still require written verification on their high-intensity needs funding notification form that the supplies and services are clinically necessary. So none of that has changed. So your claims eligibility, it will vary with each of the new claims criteria. However, the one thing that is in common there is it cannot be accessed for convalescent care beds or your short stay respite beds or your LDCAP beds either, actually. And I would just refer you to look at the suggest that you look at the High Intensity Needs Fund Policy Manual. That would give you the more concrete area around how you can submit and what the criteria would be. So some of the eligibility requirements on the homes, from the home's perspective, is that the home must have a procurement process in place, and they must have policies around that. So if the ministry were to come in and ask to see those must be there and available for the ministry. And that's just to show that the home is doing their due diligence around the supplies, services, and that they're obtaining when they're for the residents in the home. And again, that goes back to that being most cost effective and the services being the most appropriate for the residents. So items that aren't eligible for the high intensity needs claims as we see them now are items that are now covered through that per diem in the nursing and personal care envelope or in the raw food envelope. So those would be items such as your food, or your feeding pumps, the supplies that go along with those feeding pumps. They're expected now to be paid out of those per diems. So the raw food per diem would cover the cost of the formulas in theory, but the pumps and things like that would come out of the MPC per diem that you have now. So you can no longer claim those as a separate item the way we used to. Expenses that exceed the reasonable cost for supplies or services may be kicked back, but that would be determined by the Ministry of Health, and it's at their discretion. And you would have that conversation with them if and when that were to happen. So some of the things that the ministry has done, I think, to help try to clarify some of the changes that were happened in the 2013 change to the funding, was they've given us information along the way, because I think as people were trying to submit claims and that they were probably finding that there were various areas that were consistent concerns or areas that we needed some clarification around, because the one area especially, I think, being the exceptional wound care area, because that was a new claim for us, and we didn't all know exactly what that might have meant. So in a memo from the Ministry of April 2013, they suggested that wounds that are categorized as chronic and intractable, which were the wounds that they were suggesting were in the exceptional wound category claims, were the wounds that were unlikely to heal after other treatments and methods of healing had been tried but proven ineffective. So they were truly trying to give us now some definition of what that exceptional wound claims category meant. And just recently, last month, we also received in a memo that reminder that the VAC therapy would not be approved for chronic wounds. And I think that was, in a lot of cases, I've heard that that's been sort of a challenge for homes. I know we've had homes specifically where we've used VAC therapy, which can be really costly, obviously beneficial to the resident in the long run if in fact you end up with some wound healing there, but extremely costly and sometimes difficult for a smaller home to be able to manage those costs out of that 63-cent nursing per diem. But at this point, that is the expectation, as I know it. The potential financial impact that these changes have had to the home is the High Intensity Needs Funding Central team will assess the claims and the funding requests for eligibility and compliance with the new policies. And I think we're seeing that sometimes homes don't always agree. I know that homes will go back to that team, and at times they've been able to make a case and have had the funding approved and received reimbursement, but that's not always the case. So in those areas where that hasn't happened, there has been sometimes some financial hardship to that home in that they've provided some care and services that have been costly, and they will now have to manage somehow under the nursing and personal care envelope. So the home can find that those will have the really stretch their financial resources in NPC and the raw food envelopes. So it's balancing those high-intensity needs costs with the envelope spending. So what do? Some of those higher cost items could potentially really stretch the resources within the homes and the envelopes. And it's still an expectation that the long-term care homes are able to meet the needs of their existing residents and to be able to meet the needs of any of their new admissions or new residents coming in. And just because a resident has a tube feed or a high-cost wound care need is not an excuse or not a reason to be able to decline admission to the home. So it's that balance, and I'm sure we all do it as DOCs or managers in homes. We look at that application and know that that's going to be that G-tube that's really going to push you over the edge, but it isn't necessarily a reason that you can decline admission to your home. You just know that it's going to have a financial impact. And it's balancing those things and still making sure we meet the needs of all of our residents. So some examples of some of those potential high-cost items that we're now seeing that have to go through that nursing and personal care envelope are therapeutic services. So they are considered to be part of the preventative measures homes should be taking when providing care to residents. And these can be expensive. In a small home, that per diem can be eaten up very quickly through a couple of therapeutic services that we want for our residents. So it can be really quite challenging for a smaller home to be able to absorb that. And the expectation now is that those therapeutic services will come through that per diem. And if you don't have enough, that you can use your other MPC envelope funding to help offset the costs. There's various treatments, as I've referred to, supplies and equipment that can be quite costly that are now expected to come through that MPC envelope. And things like your VAC therapies, as everybody knows, are quite expensive and can be quite beneficial to the residents. And some of the enteral feed formulas can be extremely costly. And as much as people can get their registered dietitians involved to look at, is there some change to those formulas? I think those are some of the things that people look to do, but we can't always, sometimes we have some success with that, but not always. So again, that can be an area that can really push that 12 cents in the raw food envelope. So really, in summary, I would just be suggesting, I know from our organization, I would say this has been a real learning curve for the homes. It's been a challenge in some cases to really manage those envelopes in a different way than we've had historically in the past. So we've learned along the way how to best manage the 63 cent per diem and the 12 cents that we've received from the ministry, and yet still make our lives and the quality of life for our residents the best that we can. And the homes, to do that, have had to develop and adopt some strategies to meet the needs of their residents and to continue to be fiscally responsible. And so that sort of segues into Susan, who's the next presenter and is going to give you some of those strategies.